Then. So please then let me introduce then the next speaker. I'm happy to have here Fernando Zalamea. He's professor of mathematics at the University National of Colombia. And he's a philosopher, historian of mathematics. And for me, I came through to him through his synthetic philosophy of contemporary mathematics. Right? So please, Fernando, to you.
Thank you, Professor Walsh, for the introduction. Thank you very much, Mirna and Andres, for all the organization. It has been a beautiful experience. I will begin to share my screen. It should be there now.
Yes, it's fine.
You should be seeing the screen. Okay. So thanks again, Mirna, for all this beautiful idea, and Andres for all the help that you are giving to Mirna and the organization. So I will speak about the idea of solidarity from the perspectives of Peirce's Pragmatic Maxim and category theory. I wanted to give a talk in some sense similar to the one that Andres already gave, using the layers of several languages. And at first I thought I was going to speak in English, in Spanish and French and Italian with several layers intertwined between them. But since this has been already done and we have had beautiful conferences in several languages, I will stick to the English in order to simplify the presentation. So it will be organized in two parts. The first part is what is mentioned there by 1 and 2, which is a kind of a general framing to produce an analysis of the idea of solidarity. And then I will try to analyze that idea of solidarity using both Peirce's Maxim and some trends from category theory. So Peirce's Pragmatic Maxim is something that Peirce produced around the 1870s, in which the idea of Peirce was that if we want to understand knowledge, knowledge has to be understood through the analysis of signs. And then you have to, in a sense, try to understand what are the effects of a sign. The usual effects of a sign can be reduced to the actual. That is called a pragmatic attitude. You are interested in the actual effects of something. And if you are in a sense pejorative, then you will say this person is a pragmatic person because he's interested only in the economic actual effects of his actions, of her actions. Peirce went well beyond that, and the idea of Peirce is better understood through the term Pragmaticist Maxim. Beyond the Pragmatic Maxim, he introduced the idea that the sign must be understood not only in the actual, but through necessary conditions and through possibility conditions. So it's a full model understanding of the pragmatic usual maxim that we know in our world. So the Peirce's pragmaticism is a simple but very profound idea that if you want to understand the sign, you have to represent the sign in several contexts. In each context, you will have a good representation, and then you will have a way to understand the necessary actions and reactions in that context. But then you have to go through all possible contexts, and that possibility gives you an important sense of liberty. So this addresses directly the liberty problem proposed by Mirna several times, the importance of the liberty of the construction of a free society in some sense. And this is also related to what Menachem Magidol was saying in his conference about the fight between what is local in different contexts and which is global when you try to reintegrate the information in the beyond the different localities. This is also related to what Margot Glantz was expressing in her presentation today, At left, you can see what we may call the differentials, the localities, the modulations of knowledge, what we may call the Twitter fragmentation of knowledge. Instead, at right, you can have the usual traditional architectonical novel, which is more an integral understanding of the world. So there is a fight between the differential and the integral, between the localities and the globalities, which is clearly stated in the Pragmaticist maxim. And the main problem in the Pragmaticist maxim is to understand these correlations, gluings, and transfers between the local and the global, between the relative and the universal. So how can you, in a sense, glue relatives and universals? You can glue relative and universals, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, by the idea of a relative universal, which in a sense seems a contradiction, but is a very interesting contradiction. Let me show first how you can see with a simple image, the correlation between the Pragmaticist maxim at the top and the understanding of category theory in the bottom part. Category theory is a way to provide universal definitions beyond the technical regions of mathematics, beyond algebra, topology, or differential geometry, or logic, or set theory, or whatever region of mathematics that you want. The categoricians try to find some universal definitions, some archetypes which go beyond the types, some abstractions which can be projected on the concrete several regions of mathematics. This is related to the pragmatic maxim that you can see on the top. The sign is something which is in a sense abstract, and it becomes determined to different contexts. And the understanding of those different contexts and the correlations between the different contexts, it's one of the fundamental tools of category theory. How do you introduce functors between different categories in order to provide some gluing substance of information. This is also related to this idea then that we can talk about relative universals. The idea of a universal in some kind of absolute framing, philosophical framing, seems something impossible now, but we can think about relative universals in the sense of category theory that you have here at left, some universal definitions. They don't live in an absolute, they are relative, but they are so general that they can be then concreted or materialized in different contexts, different worlds. So this idea of relative universal is something that category theory produces in a very technical and precise sense, and corresponds to what I am saying there with the arrows. You partially encode signs and representations. You partially try to glue the local and the global, and you partially try to integrate the concrete and the abstract. This is related to the ideal that, in a sense, Maria Clara Cortez was presenting in her talk, in which we have to take care of slow processes. Those slow processes have to look very carefully to the in-between. The in-between is looking carefully to the encoding, to the cluing, to the integration. And this is also related to that multiplication, that centuple of Valéry that Andres was showing us in a moment before. This is also related to the importance of learning and some kind of good ethical conduct against any dogmatism that Marco Panza was forcefully introducing yesterday. So I will use then these two tools, the tools of pragmatism and the tools of category theory, to understand the idea of solidarity. So let's talk a little about this solidarity. This solidarity can live, for example, very much in the actual when we think about great movements of solidarity in the past. For example, the Solidarnosc movement in Poland, where in some moment there were 10 million people connected to this solidarity action, which was very, very impressive, or the solidarity action that is happening now in the United States around the Black Lives Matter, where you don't have millions of people, but you have at least thousands of people protesting against the system. So there are actual political movements which are very important in the actuality, but which correspond to part of the general problem. The general problem, if we look at it in a pragmaticist sense, has to do with the different care that local governments, communities, or individuals produce in the sense of having, producing some care of the other, looking beyond the self. That care is produced in several countries, has been done in several regions. At the beginning, for example, in the Lombardia that Marco was talking yesterday, in several different parts, there have been local actions to try to take care really of the other people. And the central problem of correlating and gluing the solidarities, the correlations and gluings and transfers were also mentioned by Yogendra Yadav when he was talking about the construction of innovative hybrids, which would, in a sense, produce more solidarity between the people. And there was the idea that we have some hope in that sense. We have to hope, we have a hope, the esperanza that Carlos Cardona was showing so beautifully with the history, the variable historical correlations that knowledge has produced about hope, and also the blow up that Andrés was presenting in a moment before. And we have some hopes, and those hopes are related to this kind of functorial solidarity, in which we may have the hope and, in a sense, the ideal that the pragmatic differentials will be really connected to the pragmatic integral. There will be a real solidarity in many senses, not only in the sense of the multitudes in the streets, but also in a sense, in a more philosophical and in a mathematical, also artistical sense, a sociological sense, in which we have this functorial solidarity between the different contexts. Nevertheless, this functorial solidarity has instead of the positive perspective, has a lot of negative perspectives coming, for example, from the very clear Trump and Bolsonaro inactions in which instead of having an action for the other, you have a reaction tended to the self. This kind of very important danger that I am putting then, becoming to put in red, contrasts with the hope of the blue perspectives, which are in blue. And this was also very, very strongly sensed in the presentation of Asra Aksamiya when she presented us the closure images, but also with that, beyond that, the unbearable silence of her presentation. It was really impressive. It was probably not meant in purpose, but that unbearable silence was very, very strong. And it had that sense of inaction and reaction happening everywhere. Also, at the beginning of the conference, Igor Sticks pointed very carefully that we don't have so much space for optimism in this situation. So if we begin to look at the solidarity perspective, the solidarity problem from different perspectives, it depends a lot on the local actions and the local inactions and the construction of better possible worlds. Is that possible or not? Is that kind of blue perspective something that can happen in the future or not? My sense is that it will not happen. And I will be finishing now my minutes with this last slide, in which I think after the pandemic, there will be a strong solidarity crisis. The solidarity crisis was already, in a sense, imagined by Yadav also, when he was talking about the precariousness and the collapse of Western civilization. It was sensed by Menachem Magidor when he was saying that there is a strong financial crisis that will affect strongly our perspectives beyond. But I can think of some contradictory conditions that I think will be mainly fundamental in the post-pandemic world. It will be, I have the sense that against the actual construction of solidarity, for example, that happened in the Solidarność movement in Poland, there will be, after this pandemic passes, a strong sense of not of communitarian construction, but on the contrary, of an exacerbated individualization, because people will become again in contact with the world, and in that contact with the world, the individualization will be, I have the sense, extremely strong. Also, beyond the beautiful ecological relief that many of you have presented in previous talks, I have the sense that the world will come back to an exacerbated industrialization. And against listening to the scientists, there will be a doctrinalization which will be very, very strong again, coming from several parts. So I am very, very skeptic and very pessimistic about what will happen afterwards. And that can be explained, and I will be finishing now, with the Pragmatic Maxim and category theory, because these conditions may break completely a solidarity effort. A systematic superposition of negationism may appear. This kind of negativity, I think, will be the main point. And if we look at that negativity in the main point, here you have the Pragmaticist maxim applied to solidarity, where solidarity simply will disappear completely, and all the other things will behave. So I'm, in a sense, also, in a sense, as glance a little catastrophic here, but that's the sense that I have, that the non-care will be important, that the change will not be possible, that the inactions will stand over the action, with the reaction of the self will come back with very, very strong tendencies, and where this part is extremely dangerous for me, the disappearance of the integrality, where the differentials will be exacerbated in many, many senses. The multiplications of the individual doctrines, for example, I think will be some kind of emergence which will happen in some moment. For me, that's a good example of the Twitter. The Twitter differentiation is an exacerbation of the non-thinking for me. And on the contrary, the disappearance of the integrality of thought will be something very, very strongly which will happen in the post-pandemic world. People will tend not to think in an integral way, but in a very, very differential way, making more sense of this kind of exacerbated individualization and doctrinalization. Can we fight against that? I think that is the whole purpose of this conference, and the whole purpose of Mirna's courage and vision. But I think that the pragmatic maxim would show in a sense that solidarity may disappear. So that was my presentation in 20 minutes. So I can open the questions.
Thank you.
Stop presenting.
So, do we have any questions or comments of people for Fernando?
May I?
I certainly have a question. No, go ahead, Mona. Go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Fernando. It's so beautiful to hear how you can connect abstract thought with what is happening in a very everyday situations. Thank you also for all the compliments that you have given me. I hope to deserve some of them. I wanted to tell you how it is here in France, because we have been sort of deconfined since the 11th of May. So what are the kinds of things that we can observe? It seems really positive. I hope it continues like that. I don't know if it is because we are still rather controlled. For example, the meetings of more than 10 people are still not allowed, even though there were large meetings, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. But still, we are not seeing the negativity that has been here since 2015 on, when we had those strikes of the Parisian metro, which lasted for almost 2 months. It's just really horrible, or with some excuse of doing something good for people, actually was doing something really bad. And so forth. There was a lot of negativity, and somehow it seems to be on pause. Maybe it will come back. But for the moment, it seems like a good moment to live. Yeah. I'm very interested to hear other people's questions. So.
That's nice to hear that, Anders.
Yeah, this tension between negativity and positivity, I think we're living through it in an almost daily basis. When you look at some encouraging news, such as what Mirna is describing right now, and when you look at the very dire evolution of the political situation in response to pandemics in places like the United States or Brazil. You mentioned the two presidents of those countries, but also in many other parts of the world, and how it may be the pandemic may be used, I don't know, by Orban in Hungary, or by Netanyahu in Israel, or by our own leadership here in Colombia, exactly in the direction that you're pointing out. However, let me just say that things may be happening in different layers, and there is that global layer that unfortunately affects us all. I mean, if there is a stupid decision made in the United States, and that is happening now on a daily basis. It is. I mean, people can make stupid decisions. I mean, the history is full of that people try to correct or mitigate, kind of the damage. But there, it looks almost like they're enjoying. Their president is enjoying this, making horrific decisions every single day that destroy whole swaths of history of their own country, of the many good parts of history of their own country. I don't need to go into details of that, but at local levels, you see the Black Lives Matter movement that somehow is stronger now than something like that has been for a long time in the United States. It's difficult to judge how strong it is really, and to gauge exactly how much, because there is definitely this tension between these two forces that you're contrasting, this negativity or self and this solidarity. And in a way, the only way is to create even more pockets of resistance at this sort of level. I mean, it's very few people compared to the world population, but I think this sort of events may have may have an effect, and we have effect on maybe students or people we talk to. It may be a small pocket of an effect, perhaps, but I think the sort of connections that have been drawn here, and the sort of connections that can be done, maybe not at that global level, but at more local levels, will be extremely important. And I'd like to hear, because especially if you, Fernando, you are a person who always insists on, like the tension between things going in different directions, and the, integration and differentiation, and perhaps, and it is very scary to think that you think that differentiation is going to somehow win for a long time, and the integrating forces are going to kind of disappear. I'd like to offer, I don't know, maybe that will happen, but in different layers we'll have different things. I don't know.
I think that what you are saying is very important. The different layers and the relativity of the situation. And the resistant pockets are probably the most important thing. And in fact, the resistance that was provided in India, or the resistance that are taught in Serbio-Croatian or our Latin American resistance, etc. Those things are interesting. I think that is the only thing that we can do. We can only try to move or to change at the local level, and try to do our best at the local level. But to try to, if we use again the pragmatic maxim in a methodological and philosophical and also mathematical sense, is it possible that the different pockets of resistance, of local resistance, can be glued in a local resistance? My sense is that absolutely not. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. There is not a global resistance. The very idea of global resistance is something that cannot be taught, because the resistance must be local. The resistance must be from some periphery, for example, against the center. The idea of the resistance that you did in your talk about the different layers of language, that I wanted also to do in my talk, but finally I decided to do it in English, because in some sense I surrendered to the importance of English. That kind of situation is something that is difficult to understand at a global level. So I think it's very, very important that we do our best in our localities, in our mathematics or philosophy or theory or category theory or Persian studies or whatever, to try to produce around us some sense of hope. But my general idea is that the world is very, very far from what we are thinking, and that the people in the world are not at all interested in the things that we are looking here. They are interested in coming back to the streets and be very individual. And as Margot Lanz was saying in some moment, to go to make crazy queues to buy some things. People are interested in other things. It's very scary, and that sense of fear is very strong to me in this moment. I have the sense that that the very methodological tools that we have are showing us and the direction that finally the differential will be strong, very strong differentials around the world. And the idea of integrating is something that many of us fight very, very strongly, but it's almost something which is lost. I am very, very skeptical.
Might I ask, could you elaborate on one thing that was on your penultimate slide? I mean, you talked about exacerbated doctrinalization after listening to science or scientists. Could you elaborate a bit more what you meant about this?
Yes, here, this kind of post-pandemic, what I call the post-pandemic contradictory conditions. And this is also, this can be also related nicely to several of the previous talks. And the idea that Carlos Cardona introduced about how in the popular belief now, and the people are listening to the epidemiologist, to the normal curves, and the expected value of the curve. And every day, Alejandro Martin was saying, in a sense, mocking also himself and mocking the situation. We are looking at the numbers every day. This kind of situation is something which is completely contingent. It will disappear. It will disappear very quickly after the vaccine is obtained. So next year it will disappear. People will not be interested in science anymore, even if they are looking at very poor expectation of sciences. And they will come back to the usual movements of mankind. People follow doctrines. I think that people follow continually doctrines, and science which goes against doctrines will disappear when the vaccine will be obtained. So that was what I wanted to say in that line. But it is also related to what Alejandro was saying also in his presentation, that what is happening in this time is that there is a sense of individual space which is working around us. We have different times, but the space has disappeared. We are single points in the space, and this sense of disappearance of a communitarian space is something which worries me a lot. The communitarian space, and for me the best communitarian space would be the Solidarność movement in Poland. That was a real, very, very important actual communitarian space. Will that happen after the pandemic? I think that not at all. I think that it will be just the contrary. The individuals will explode. There will be a kind of explosion of the self, which will be monstrous in a sense.
Yes, I see. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to be so negative, but it's kind of the view of a person who looks at the possible consequences of the world through Peirce. Peirce always shows us that things will be very different than we think they are.
But this belief in science, I have already started witnessing it, even in my not my small family circle, fortunately, but my more extended family circle. What you're saying has already started happening, and it is almost impossible to block them from saying completely crazy things. But yeah, George.
Yes, I don't necessarily want to put it to question your pessimism, but perhaps the interpretation of your pessimism. I see the dangers as being rather different. What you say about people following a doctrine, well, that really only works in a situation in which the ruling doctrine still has some force. I think we're in an era where we're seeing the end of the current ideology. I think if you look at young people, they simply don't believe in the neoliberal capitalist ideology. They may not believe in anything else that's coherent. and actually, in that respect, there is a certain resemblance with the Solidarność movement, which I was actually quite close to myself, because people, yes, it's true that there was a great movement of solidarity amongst people, but the solidarity was really against the existing regime and in favor of some kind of autonomous autonomy, which, and the unifying factor was the overthrow of the existing regime, in which no one believed anymore. And actually, what happened was that the movement split into different factions, and of course we saw eventually the development of a kind of neoliberal capitalism in Poland. But the original ideology of Solidarność and the solidarity of the movement was dissipated quite quickly because of that. But turning to our present situation, I think the parallel is that we are again in a situation in the West now, well, not in the West, but in the whole world, where the dominant ideology is no longer believable, at least amongst young people. But they don't have something with which to replace it with. Now, in that kind of situation, after the pandemic is over, and given that I think most of us agree with the economic crisis and so forth will get worse, there's no reason why people are likely to go back to believing in a system that doesn't work. The danger, as I see it, is something quite different. The danger is that people will come to believe in messianic solutions and see in those messianic solutions a form of solidarity, a false form of solidarity. And I have in mind here an example from history, from Jewish history, of the false messiah Sabbatai Tzvi, or Tzvi, who lived in the 17th century and started a messianic movement, which ended pretty disastrously, but actually was an extraordinary movement in its time. And even Newton asked questions about it. But Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote a novel called Satan in Gorai, which was about this. And I have actually not read this novel, but I understand, according to some interpretations of the novel, that Bashevis Singer's interpretation of these events was that although Sabbatai Tzvi's movement started as a reaction to the terrible pogroms, the Helmitsky pogroms, which had been 30 years earlier or so, that actually what transpired was worse than the effects of the pogroms, and then what had transpired in this movement was caused by a false hope, and that the real enemy of people was a false hope. So that I think is a lesson that we need to learn in the present situation. I don't think the danger is that people will continue to believe in the existing ideology. I think the danger is that they will follow some messianic ideology, believing it to be restoring some sense of community.
Thank you very much for your talks, Professor. I agree completely with them, and in the way of the dangers of doctrinalizations. Two of the perspectives that you offered are the ones which are the ones that I am most fearful about. It's one, of course, the messianic construction, which is something which will be something very, very difficult and hard for the communities. But the other one is the non-belief of the young people. The young people are in a moment in which they don't believe in anything. That will become a doctrine in some sense. That doctrine of non-believing in anything, that will be also something very difficult to handle in some sense. And this is also related to what Janet Vicky was saying in a moment, which was a beautiful vision that she had. She mentioned the extreme centripetal acceleration of this moment. Extreme centripetal acceleration. So everything is falling apart. Everything is falling apart. The differentials are, in a sense, submerging us. We will be submerged in a lot of differences, in a lot of non-beliefs, and there will be no integral understanding of the situation. That, I think, is a very, very difficult situation. I don't see that it will be solved at all.
Philip, have you seen that Meenakshi had several comments in the
Oh, sorry, I was
in
not
the
paying
chat?
attention to the chat. It's gone.
See, Meenakshi is reading. We see that all this is happening in India already.
Oh, this is about Modi is Messiah in India.
Okay.
So perhaps this is referring back to what George was saying here. Yes, sorry, I'm going back. Yes, we can see this happening in India already. Meenakshi is also saying there was never any solidarity to begin with. There was solidarity among members of civil society initially, but now there's just exhaustion. People are now gradually only rooting for themselves. Modi as Messiah in India, leading India out of the darkness into light. Well, this is the idea is bought by very many. And is this a form of solidarity? And she says, of course, I'm not sure. So this would chime in with what George has just been saying here. And lastly is from Maria, isn't part of the reasons for not trusting scientists now the existence of the pandemic itself? How can we justify such an unexpected expansion of a virus after all the recent advancement of science and technology? I'm not trying to justify the skepticism, just trying to understand it. And again,
May I say something on that?
The same can be said with Trump.
Oh, okay. I'd like to answer to Maria Clara, can I?
But
I'm sure everybody else can answer.
It's not me, it's another Maria.
Oh, I'm sorry, Maria.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry.
My assumption. Maria's iPad. Yeah.
Oh, I see. So let us answer to this other Maria. Hi, Maria. I think that it is not the science has failed. That's the politics that has failed by lying to people over the years that science can produce things like in a supermarket. Science is not a supermarket. It takes years and centuries of research to develop something. And actually developments in science are more like miracles and not things to be ordered and bought in a drive-in. And people have this skepticism because they've been told that the impact of scientific research and their tax money is going to happen in a year or in 6 months. And that's really the reason that there is this misunderstanding of what science actually can do.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Well, that's scientist word against politician's word. And if I'm standing in between the two, you know, they are just two statements, two people pointing at each other. Scientists saying politicians have deceived you, and politicians saying scientists have deceived you, and people don't have anything in any way to discern between the two. I think the way to discern between the two is that politicians have chosen as their business line to convince people of things. And scientists have neglected that thing, so that, the fact that the population is expecting from scientists to resolve pandemics before these pandemics happen shouldn't be blamed on politicians, because that's their business to blame others, but it should be blamed on scientists because they didn't explain to people what science is capable and supposed to do.
But maybe it's I shouldn't, it's not so much like the blame is here or there, perhaps. It's more the society. I mean, the work, the way the society works has led people to expectations of what Mirna described as supermarket, like a drive-in kind of a everything. So drive-in, literature for some, drive-in science for some, and so on. But it is a kind of more structural thing. Of course, you see, I must say that some of my science colleagues have become, in the past discussions, extremely dogmatic in their own way, perhaps for good reasons. I mean, they have, of course, but they are not engaged in this recent dialogue, at least, in what I've followed here in national level and some international. Some of them just completely dismiss. And one big problem is showing science as a monolithic thing. There's science, with big S, and science is here. Therefore, you can consume it, as Mirna says, or not consume it, but it is here, like a church or something like that. Whereas science is, as we know very well, who are, those of us who are in science faculties and so on, that it is extremely varied. That what happens in the, in the pharmacy, in the chemistry department is quite different from what happens in the mathematics department. And even inside mathematics, what happens in applied math is quite different to what happens here in logic and even within logic. So science, first of all, is not a singular and it's not monolithic, but it should be kind of projected much more as plural and as changing. And this sort of a uniform, like never changes, always has, is somehow the view that has been projected, I think by a combination of politicians, as Mirna says, and maybe some scientists have contributed to that sort of a mythological view that is affecting, it is creating a huge problem, a huge mess at this point.
Thank you. Maybe we should stick a bit to the timetable. I don't know. It's a very interesting discussion. I don't want to break it off, but also I'm feeling maybe we should let Dushko talk now. Okay, well, let's thank Fernando once more then for the talk. It was very nice.
Thank you, Fernando.
Okay.